everyone. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Andy Thaggart, and welcome to the Army Aviation Media Roundtable here at AUSA Hot Topics on Wednesday, September the 4th. You've heard from all these panel members already. Their nameplates are in front, so we're not going to do introductions of everyone. We have 30 minutes today. It's an on-the-record event. Opening statement will be provided by General Gill, and then we'll transition to Q&A. In the interest of time, please limit yourself to one question and one related follow-up in the first round. If time permits, we'll go another round. When asking your question, please state your name and organization. We'll begin the questions on the right, because the last time I did this, we started on the left. So we'll start on the right. Please keep your questions related to Army Aviation. All right, and now we will begin with our opening statement with General Gill.
Okay, thanks Andy, and thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks for spending the day with us. You've already heard me talk 3 times now, so I think you know where I stand in terms of the pride that I have in our branch. Certainly very honored to be a member of this 6-pack. It's not all here, but some fairly new, a couple of us new to the position, but been operating in this on this team or in support of this team for years. So what I hope you got out of today is the relevance for Army Aviation and what it does for the Army writ large. Right? It's not Army Aviation about Army Aviation, it's what does Army Aviation do for our Army and how we fight. And so you heard a lot of good things about the potential conflicts of the future, the environments that we're going to operate, and where we're going. So there was, some stuff we talked about, the capabilities that we have right now and maintaining those capabilities, keeping our lethality or survivability or relevance, and then the future fight, the more complex battle, the large-scale combat air operations that operate in a multi-domain environment, and where we're going in terms of some pretty big signature systems that these guys have been working on over here. And with that, we'll get started with questions.
All right, Stu Magnuson, National Defense Magazine. It was said earlier today, and at least one combatant commander said it during Quad A, that FAR has been canceled. Now what? There's some capabilities that Kiowa had, that capability gaps, people are saying. And so the question is, what are these gaps and what are you doing to fill them now that this program has been canceled?
Yeah, so the reconnaissance gap is still there. I mean, the FARA was specifically built to address that gap. What we're looking at now is how do we mitigate it with other things, right? So what can we do with what we have, and what other things might we buy? And I think that's where General Baker and some of the things he talked about in terms of launch effects and other capabilities that we can develop short of a major weapon system like a new aircraft is probably the direction that we're going as an Army.
Yeah, so the FARA cancellation, I know we focus on that a lot, but I think we also have to remember FARA was always paired with launch effects. That's what really drove that capability, was, as you heard everybody talk about today, hey, extend that sensor forward, get inside that threat, be able to, sense it and target it and destroy it. So now, that capability allows us to still continue to conduct reconnaissance. The other piece with this is, when we talk this layered reconnaissance approach with all of our UASs, from the small drone all the way up to the large FTUS and LE, you heard the Vice talk about today. Hey, we'll figure out where we're going to land and how many we want and how we need. But this nested ISR approach is critical in covering a portion of this gap. What we're working through now is, hey, how do we deliver launch effects to the end of the tactical battlefield to even extend further out into into that IADS range? It's the hard part of this, and that David and I work through with the proponent and the branch chief.
Well, one of your predecessors a long time ago at a Quad A thing, and I can't remember who it was, and I've looked at my back issues trying to find this quote, but he said during one of the cancellations of Kiowa replacement, between them, said that maybe UAS can be the solution instead of pursuing another helicopter program. Of course, that's not what happened. But today, are there things that only a manned, 2 men in the helicopter can do that a UAS could never do?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a man in the loop is always you know, a dynamic capability that you have. It's somebody that is in the environment with the people that they're supporting, right? So they're talking to the radio, talking to them on the radio. They can see what they're seeing. They can feel the emotion on the battlefield. They can look and see other things that are not necessarily just in a screen, and they can do multiple missions, right? So they might be doing reconnaissance. They might be able to provide fire support. They might be able to provide some sort of a, you know, emergent CASEVAC. So there's always a dynamic that humans bring to it. There's also a lot of vulnerabilities that humans bring to it, right? Machines don't get tired. Machines don't make mistakes unless they're programmed to make mistakes. Machines, you know, don't like run out of their duty cycle. They don't need to eat. So we have a saying, you know, if it's dirty, dull, or dangerous, we probably ought to put a machine on it, at least first. And then if you need somebody that's a thinking person that has experience, has a little bit of that situational awareness, then you introduce the human.
Hi, I'm actually working with Breaking Defense. You have Edge coming up. I know Launch Defects was supposed to be one of the focal points for that. Could you sort of walk us through what new tech you're going to be testing out there, concepts of operations, potential decision points that could come out of it?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier today, you know, we took Edge this year, and we really wanted to pinpoint it down to really autonomy and behaviors. And so several months ago, we sent out requests for information to industry, and we said, hey, we'd like for you to come out to the Western testing area and bring your surrogates or even your platforms like your LE and FUS, and we want to see behaviors inside a contested environment. And so that resulted in 5 industry partners with about 30 different surrogates. And then additionally, we've got representation across the Joint Force with about 7 different pieces of tech from the government. We've established really some battlefield geometry out there at the brigade, division, and corps against replicated threat, you know, with our live emitters. And now we're going to ask industry to actually fly a mission set against those threats. And what we will take away from there are really 3 things. One, how well did your internal teaming behaviors act, you know, with inside your surrogates? 2, externally to those surrogates working with other teams, how did they respond and work together? And then lastly is how do they work against a threat? And I mentioned earlier today, this is really what we're doing out at the Western Training Area. It's the second phase of what we did earlier this last month with our waveform characterization. So behaviors, back to the waveform on how we can test that. And then with the Joint Force, we're nested with Vanguard underneath the MI Center of Excellence. We're actually working data, sharing data from another sensor capability out at another location over about 500 or 600 miles to be able to now to bring it into our launch effects. And so we're testing the depth of that capability.
So some of the tech, you also got, the Army also released an RFI, I guess back in June, for Group 4 or 5 UAS. Will you be testing some of those capabilities out there? And are you envisioning this as a new aircraft or a new drone or a replacement for the Gray Eagle?
Yeah, we won't be doing anything at the Group 4 level. That wasn't a part of the experiment, but if okay, I'll hand it over to David on what we were doing with that RFI.
Yeah, so that Group 4-5 RFI was specifically to ask industry what has been advancing in technologies in the past 5 to 10 years, so we could then understand that and inform requirements coming out of the CDID, or Capabilities Development Integration Directorate, so they can then look at their draft requirements they have on the shelf and say, okay, what is the direction we're headed accurate from a payload, range, speed, capabilities for the future.
And then just to circle back on Edge, one last thing is what we're doing out at Edge is really informing our next set of requirements for launched effects in UAS. Those behaviors that we're capturing, you know, it's back to what the Vice Chief said today and what Major General Gill and myself talked about is that iterative approach. And so the outcome of Edge really drives our set of requirements. experience than when we were in that position.
Thank you.
Todd South, Army Times. For General Brahman and Major General Gill, if I mix up who said what, please correct me, but I got it all in my notes, trust me.
Sure.
So obviously Army Times really focused on the personnel, training, professional development, those types of things. Sadly, we've had the mishaps that were mentioned a couple times today. I was just wanted some clarification or additional information, if you don't mind, talking about the issues with rotor effectiveness and quote authority issues in some of these mishaps. And then additionally, I think there was some discussion about changing the gating procedure for training especially and warrant officer development. So it's a lot of jumbled in there, but I just wondering, like, what's the kind of bullet point understanding what's happening with aviation safety? And
Do you want to speak to terror effectiveness just in terms of?
Absolutely, sure, happy to. Yeah, so from those specific incidents, like General Gill said earlier, some of those had a contributing factor of the amount of authority that the tail rotor has. So as most of our aviation force knows, when your tail rotor doesn't have that authority, you start to turn, right? And so at higher altitudes, higher gross weights, we went back and looked at all that data to determine how much contribution did that have to what happened during that incident. And I believe we've learned a lot from that on what was affecting and what wasn't affecting that, and we've got plans in place to add new tail rotor blades, develop new tail rotor blades for the Apache, a new tail rotor drive system for the Apache, and that will just give additional margin for those high altitude and high gross weight conditions.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that I think we had 9 Apache crashes and 10 aircraft, something like that this year. About half of them had that sort of commonality. The other ones had a variety of other reasons. To your question about warrant officer PME and the development, what we're trying to do is not create the warrant officer to be a captain-like staff officer, right? We want the warrant officers to track into whatever track that they're going. So if they're going to be instructing, if they're going to be maintaining, if they're going to be safety officers or mission survivability officers, we want them to specialize in that. And so the idea behind when they come back to Fort Novosel for training is we're going to focus them. So when they come back, they're going to go through that course as part of their PME, and then they're going to dive into it. So, and that's going to go all the way up through a master's level course. And when I say master's, I'm not talking degree, I'm talking about like a master of the profession for W5s. That's going to teach them, because that's really the first time when we start sending them back out to the Army to be broadened officers that you're going to serve on a high level staff and provide some of that expertise.
And just to follow up, a little different topic, but a similar area, I think, General, you mentioned some of what the aviation side now is doing is kind of bringing itself up to bear with the division focus of the ground elements.
Right.
I know that's a longer process, a lot of doctrine to be written, but just again, in summary, kind of where would things look different to someone in aviation, say 3 to 5 years from now, once that's kind of into effect?
You want to talk FDU, Matt?
If John, from a standpoint of what we're going to provide the division commanders.
Right, like, well, how might it look different in the near future, like in the near term, 3 to 5 years out versus how it looks now?
Sure, so beginning 26, I mean, the wheels are in motion for FDU as we speak. We'll see the first transition of units in 26, but I alluded to it a little bit in discussion earlier. We're being very deliberate in that transition because we don't want to ingest additional friction into the force while we have extremely high op tempo. We've not done a good job of that in the past due to we're in conflict. There are things that we had to transform faster, and there are second order effects of that. So we're being very deliberate about this process, but you'll see in 26. So divisions that are armor and mechanized divisions will have less, as the chief talked about, less lift capability because they don't need it. They're not air assaulting, but likewise our light divisions up in the 10th Mountain Division, the 101st, the 82nd, the 25th, who have their means to getting around the battlefield and surviving is rapid movement through using our aviation systems. The ability to nearly double, in some cases, and 101st, almost triple the capacity in those organizations to move those troops around the battlefield in the various missions they want to do. So that's exciting for aviation. It's not new. We looked a lot like that before 9/11. Right. We're getting back to what makes sense for division commanders. We're also doing it in modularity. So we're keeping things at the battalion level pretty much the same. So an assault battalion in heavy division right now will look like an assault battalion in a light division. So we have modularity to meet the non-division requirements of a combatant commander that needs an aviation footprint. They can come from anywhere, modularity, but we've instead of gone modular at the brigade level, or now we're really modular at the battalion and below level to provide that flexibility. But it's going to be exciting for aviation, and it's going to allow us to really hone the skills of large-scale combat operations.
Thank you.
Steve Trimble with Aviation Week. On FLRAA, first a request that you actually name it, so I can stop calling it FLRAA. But then I know that the focus right now is getting to FUE in 2030, but there is an increment coming after that, not too long after that. And I was wondering at this point what you're focusing on for the upgrades that will be coming with that increment, and when you want to get that contract.
That's definitely good.
Yeah, so our job in the requirements is, is to build that really increment 2. I would say it's not really an increment, it's called version 2. Right now, my team is heavily focused really across Army Aviation and Joint Community. There's really 3 things that we're looking at. One is what additional pilotage capabilities that we want to put on there from a sensor standpoint. The second piece is from advanced avionics that we would like for that to go on there. And then finally, we talked about launched effects in the original capabilities development, but we'll also expand that if, as we look at other lethal capabilities that we want to add to the system. But the 2 first are the primary focuses, the pilotage and the advanced communication. That document will be shaped over the next 12 months, and then it'll go through the requirements approval process, one internally to Army's Future Command, and then up to the Army staff. And then it'll be transferred over, if approved, to David as we look that increment 2 or that version 2 as we look beyond 30 and beyond.
And then that just dovetails into why we need that open system architecture and approach, so we can integrate those capabilities quickly, affordably, and really make it the most fused capability for the crews, and those future capabilities that we bring on board have historically been challenging, and that's an intent from our open system approach, is to lower that bar for new capabilities to get on board the aircraft.
Just to follow up on that, especially on the open systems architecture, I mean, you're probably asking industry to invest and develop, advance the state of the art, but then they need a business case to get the return, and usually that's built on the sustainability, and the 70% of the life cycle goes into the back end. But the MOSA thing, sort of takes that away. So just wondering what you're seeing from industry, or potentially takes it away, or at least makes it competitive. At least that's my interpretation of the MOSA process. So, I mean, what kind of buy-in are you getting from industry on making those investments and bringing the next wave of development to
I think that's a great question, and happy to say in real time we're seeing industry coming to the table with open solutions. And so when I say open solutions, they're coming and giving us feedback. I think we talked a couple years ago about an architecture collaboration working group, and that architecture collaboration working group was to help us define those standards and interfaces. So it wasn't just something that we came up with separately from industry and their feedback. They're working with other services, so they'd come to the table and helped us define some of the component specification model for a new system. So with that, then we can share that back out with industry, and you're exactly right, it lowers the bar for competition, because now if that industry partner comes in with that new capability, that sensor, for example, that's already designed to that standard, that is a much faster and more affordable integration, and probably gets them on board the aircraft in a more over the life cycle. It might be an easier thing for them to maintain over the life cycle. So I would say there's a tension there, probably from the older ways of doing business to the newer ways of doing business. What we've seen is a lot of early adopters and people really engaging with us. We had an open system architecture conference, approach conference down at National Landing. It was about 2 months ago. There are almost 1,000 folks there from all sides of industry, other services. The Air Force, the Navy joined us. A lot of really engaged folks out there that has really done us some good to give us the feedback we need to go forward.
Because what we don't want to do between version 1 and version 2 is redesign a new aircraft. We're looking, how do you bring on technology and capability to offload pilot requirements in the cockpit? How do you put the ability to communicate at longer distances? So that was really the whole basis for FLRAA. was, you know, that architecture inside of that aircraft, so you could advance it and upgrade it over time without creating major modifications to the platform.
Hi, Dan Shear from Inside Defense. I apologize, I missed the Vice's remarks this morning, but it was mentioned, I think, by Colonel Hinkie that this model, I guess, for acquiring counter-UAS capability is going to 2-year blocks. Or can somebody sort of explain what was meant by that and what the rationale is for that, just a little bit more?
Yeah, so the idea behind that, and we're gonna try to adopt that with some of our UAS procurement, and I'll let you guys jump in on this. It's because we know the pace of change is happening so rapidly, it makes no sense to buy into the RQX, right? And then buy that for 15 years, when we know that something new will come out, some competition, technology, something's gonna drive change, and whatever that form factor looked like it was really good this year, 2 years from now, there could be a completely different concept. So the idea is we want the ability to leverage that. Every 2 years, we're just gonna say, okay, we're willing to buy something completely new. So if a BCT or a cab buys the RQX, 2 years later, the next unit might buy the RQY, right? And we're gonna be okay with that, because you heard a lot of talk about like the interfaces, right? So this idea of a common controller, a common interface, an open architecture, all these things, so that if you go to one unit, you PCS to the next unit, everything will be the same. It's just the form factor that you're gonna fly is gonna be different.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you were there when we had a set of remarks about the kind of the business approach, the acquisition approach, and the technical approach being different, the way we're doing business. I would just say that business approach is a lot more iterative, a lot less linear. It's a lot more competitive, and a lot less vendor locked. I think the acquisition approaches that we're using are based on a lot of the new authorities. So the major capability acquisitions of the past that were all very linear. We've still got a few of those in our portfolio, but a lot more middle tier acquisition, rapid prototypings, emerging capability acquisitions. We have software pathway acquisition ongoing. So a lot of new ways of doing business there, and then back just the technical approach, a different way of doing business is technically we'll be able to do that if we have a more open systems approach.
So with this iterative approach that you all are describing, I mean, you know, the chief and the secretary are trying to get Congress on board with, you know, budget line consolidation, all of that. Is that sort of in the spirit of what you all are trying to do? I mean, do these things sort of go together?
So I think there is a bit of, so in the big A acquisition, there's 3 big components. There's the requirements piece, we've talked a lot about that. There's the resourcing piece and the acquisition piece. And I would say that resourcing piece is important to maintain some flexibility there in this space, because it's got some challenges when you try to move quickly and do different things. But it's also very important to maintain transparency and the oversight with Congress. So we want to find that balance between how much we can move funding or move acquisition authorities, but it's really, we're gonna maintain that credibility and transparency with Congress going forward too.
Yeah. And I would tell you on the requirements piece, I try to avoid the funding discussion, because I don't want to limit ourselves in what we're looking at from what the enemy's doing, what we see in technology. But that's the point that, you know, we're being asked by Army senior leadership is, hey, continue to develop the program or the capability and let it keep pace, not only with technology, but stay ahead of the threat curve. And I think that's the part that they want is, hey, you know, if you see, you know, like right now you see in Ukraine, the ability, you know, the lack of GPS capability over there because it's being jammed. How do we develop a system that can operate in a GPS denied environment? That's just an example, and not really, you know, something. I mean, our systems, you know, are already set to work in that capability, but how do we look at the threat? How do we develop that capability to be able to counter that threat and to defeat that threat? And then we get it into this iteration with the PALM cycle and how we fund it and how we get it fielded.
Zach Rosenberg from James. I'm wondering if you can talk about the maturity of the concept of operations for specifically launched effects, and in particular as regards deep sensing and strike.
Yeah. So today, you know, we were talking about the air-ground littorals, right? And we talked about it, but when we talk about the air-ground littorals, it really covers the deep and close fight. But inside of that, it covers at the operation, at the tactical level, the operational level, and the strategic level. So from your combatant commanders, you know, not combatant, from your theater commanders and your land opponent commanders, all the way back down to the brigade, launched effects are designed to be able to operate across that space. So when we start talking the deep aspect of this, when we look at the launched effects and really the payloads that we want to go on those systems, is how do we get them on? How do we be able to penetrate into IADs, you know, to integrated air defenses, our fires complexes, and our missions command. So how do those systems be able to make that distance, be able to have behaviors on board, to be able to mitigate that? And then more in the close fight, you know, for our divisions and our brigades, once again, it's about sensing and also lethality to conduct their missions. But what we're doing with launched effects is really we're shaping the fight at echelon, really to get our ground forces, our land forces into position to do combined arms maneuver. And so it's really a phased approach, and those launched effects really cover the depth and breadth of the battlefield underneath that air-ground littoral conversation. You know, we talked today about the importance of the network, to be able to actually transport that information back so, you know, commanders can, one, understand the battlefield, make a decision, and affect it. And so launched effects, that overall strategy is, it's got to be able to extend into the network. We got to be able to see it, you know, across the battlefield. The payloads are critical to this piece. And then the last piece I will say is, it ties back to Edge on the question I got with Edge earlier. It's the behaviors. The behaviors I need in the deep fight may be different than the behaviors that I need in the close fight, right? I mean, one, based off of that level of threat and what the threat's going to be able to do against that capability, the terrain where it's got to fly from takeoff to its final destination and maybe in transit back. Those behaviors are different at extended ranges versus at closer ranges. So all that's a part of the strategy to bring launched effects to bear, you know, pretty quickly.
Thank you. And can you detail some of the conversations you've had with other services as regards deep sensing and deep strike as an Army role as opposed to some of these other services?
We have not had any conversations with the other services about it.
So we've got our launched effects, short, medium, and long. The acquisition path that really David's team and Mr. Bush is, we're really watching right now the Marines with their launched effect, their long range launched effect. They're nice enough, the Marines are actually bringing out a capability to Edge where we'll actually employ that long range launched effect. Really wanted to test the connectivity and how long it can fly. But you know, from a standpoint of that deep sensing, right now we're hand in hand with the Navy and what they're doing with the long range piece of LE.
Yeah, just add on that when lots of our programs at echelon, so when you're talking all the launch effects programs, the FTUAS program, and the small UAS programs, we've got some great relationships there with SOCOM as well. And a lot of the work they're doing, we've been informed by their programs, and we've informed their programs. So we're sharing there and making sure that we're not duplicating effort.
Thank you. To the back row.
Just want to take General Gill back to your comments this morning about getting back to the basics and get your aviators flying more and not spending as much time learning systems and operation and maintenance. Could you describe that a little more deeply, how that's going to happen?
Sure.
And which aviators are you talking about?
Yeah, I'll walk you from the schoolhouse out to the fleet. So right now, we're looking at how we train our aviators at Fort Novacell, right? So that's everything from the curriculum, the program of instruction, that's the aircraft that we use, and that's the model of how we pull all that together. There's about a little less than a dozen contracts involved in training aviators on Fort Novacell. I think I only own about half of them, right? The rest of them are spread out. So there's some inefficiencies, not for any fault of anybody, but over time we've kind of got to where we are right now. And if you clean sheeted it, you would probably say, this isn't the most efficient, effective way to train folks. So we're gonna take a look at that, and we're gonna probably be talking to industry about some proposals of how they might envision how we train, right? And that's gonna include things, I mentioned it earlier about augmented reality and virtual reality. Is there a better aircraft, than the one we're currently using? Is the model that we're using in terms of how many hours we're putting on people producing the right aviator that we're gonna then give out to the fleet? So that gets you just to the basic qualified aviator out of flight school, out of Fort Novosel, out to the force. Then the next challenge that we have right now, and this is due to years of under-accession in certain places, but we've got a gap in our experience level at the real readiness building levels, and that's the W2, W3s, like the senior W2s, the W3s, it's the majors, it's the people that really it's our IPs, instructor pilots, or maintenance test pilots, it's our aviation mission survivability officers, right? So because we lack those people, we have younger people training younger people. We've tried to fix that by flooding the zone with more W1s being assessed into the branch. The problem is we have too many trainees and not enough trainers right now. And so we're working through that. I mean, I think units are being pretty creative out there in terms of task organize themselves to create the most optimum conditions. I think leaders are having to get a little more involved, which is fine, that's their job, in terms of how they assess risk and what they're doing and making some tough calls.
Sorry, I'm Gina Cavallaro with Army Magazine. I'm going backwards. That's it. Thank you.
Ken Kreitzer, Cam Vets Media. Just going back to the last session about defending against drones, I just was curious, the Navy was pretty happy about how they did fighting off the Houthis, the drones and missiles that were launched at some of the Navy ships. And obviously there was success. The Army participated in knocking down the Iranian missile attack in April. I'm just curious what you learned from that, from seeing real world military activity that you had to defend at the time it happened.
Ken, thanks for that question. There may be a missile nexus for you coming here, I'm not sure, but I just spent some time on the Joint Staff where we looked at this every single day. And the one thing that I would say is the Navy did a great job, right, of protecting their ships and protecting commercial vessels that were going through the Red Sea. The Air Force did a fantastic job in protecting Israel, but we're trading, a negative cost return on investment in terms of putting multi-million-dollar missiles up against $50,000 drones, maybe. Right. I'm just swagging both of those, but the curve is in the wrong direction. Now, do we care? No. I mean, we'll shoot a missile at something that's threatening an American vessel any day. I don't think anybody regrets that. But I do think that we need to think about, like, if this is warfare in the future, how can we do it in a way that is sustainable over time? So she's in charge of a lot of missiles, so there may be a
I think the thing we
there.
saw too is that there was an integrated nature, right, to that defense. And so wherever that radar picture came from, several different nations contributed to that. So as we look at interoperability and we talk, we think about it from a regional approach, I think that was something we saw as well, was that, there were overlapping coverage pictures there that also contributed to holistically the ability to defend against all of those incoming risks.
Just in that situation, you had the situation you're working with the other armed services and combined, but you're also working with allies. And I was just curious your observation on how it was to work with all those groups when you only had a day or two to prepare and then had to act.
I think that's one of the great strengths of our network, right, is that we always operate in a combined fashion. In the case of Gaza, Israel's a very capable partner and ally, right? So they did a great job of knocking down the things that they needed to knock down to defend their country. We are seeing in the Red Sea, we saw a number of partners say they wanted to participate. Some of them don't want to overtly participate, right? Because we've got some agreements that we don't want to violate with them. So I'll just kind of leave that where it is. But there are folks that definitely see the need to operate as part of an alliance that the Central Command stood up.
Thank you.
Hi, Alex Sanchez, Shopper Media. Question about UASs. heard Deputy Secretary Kathleen Hicks praise the replicator program, which hasn't been mentioned here so far. I've also talked to Undersecretary for Research Heidi Shu, who has talked about how her office is developing prototypes of drones for ISR missions. So can you talk more about how Futures Command, the Aviation Center, engage big DoD to ensure that the projects that they're carrying out and that you're carrying out are somehow in balance, in harmony, and you're not pretty much overlapping or developing the same system twice?
So we've got a lot of discussions with folks, like I said, across the services and OSD with various programs. I can't speak to that program specifically, but I can say that for our modeling simulation, for example, we have a lot of discussions with our OSD counterparts that are working in modeling simulations that are very, looking across the joint force and how our modeling simulation fits into those discussions. I think that's probably the closest that I can get to answering your question, but there's a lot of other things going on across the department from a collaboration perspective, and we are plugged into those along the way.
I think that's a joint staff J8 function, right? They do that.
Okay, so one follow-up question, talking more about collaboration. I have had the pleasure to interview Army General Laura Richardson, the commander of Southcom, a former Army aviator, helicopter pilot. She's turning Southcom into a testing ground for emerging technologies. I know the USVs have been tested in the Caribbean. Have you engaged with her again? Have you talked to her about testing some of the new drone technology that you're working on within Southcom's AOR?
I'm gonna swag and say no. We don't reach out to COCOMs and say, hey, we want to. I mean, that's kind of the purview of the COCOMs to come back to the joint staff and say, hey, we're doing X, Y, and Z. They might drop a request for forces asking for a capability or a unit, and the joint staff will push that out to them. So she's innovating in Southcom, because she has to, because she has a very limited amount of assets that get allocated to her, and she has a very limited amount of assets that are assigned to her. So she's looking for creative ways to do it. And frankly, I think that's what every combatant commander would be expected to do.
And ladies and gentlemen, we just hit 35 minutes. So, thank you, panel, for participating today. Media, if you would stay in place while the panel departs, I'll work with you on gathering any follow-up questions.